We're broadcasting from Marrakesh, Morocco, here at the UN Climate Summit. But we're covering events closely that are taking place in the United States, and we'll soon bring you voices of protest from the front lines in New York. Meanwhile, the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center are slamming President-elect Donald Trump for naming Stephen Bannon to become his chief strategist. Bannon is the former head of the right-wing news outlet Breitbart Media. He took over as Trump's campaign manager in August. ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt said, quote, "It is a sad day when a man who presided over the premier website of the alt-right, a loose-knit group of white nationalists and unabashed anti-Semites and racists, is slated to be a senior staff member in the People's House," unquote. The Southern Poverty Law Center accused Bannon of becoming, quote, "the main driver behind Breitbart becoming a white ethno-nationalist propaganda mill," unquote. Even former Breitbart employees have spoken out about what the site became under Bannon's watch. The site's former editor-in-chief, Ben Shapiro, recently said that staffers are now openly pushing white ethno-nationalism. Donald Trump announced Bannon would become chief strategist on Saturday. Trump has also tapped RNC chair Reince Priebus to serve as his chief of staff. Steve Bannon has also faced questions about domestic abuse. He was charged in 1996 with misdemeanor domestic violence, battery, and dissuading a witness. A Santa Monica, California police report said Bannon grabbed then-wife Mary Louise Picard by the throat and arm and threatened to leave with the couple's twin daughters. Bannon pleaded not guilty to the charges, which were dropped later that year when Picard did not appear in court. Picard claimed in divorce proceedings that Bannon pressured her not to testify. Picard also said in a sworn 2007 court filing that Bannon made anti-Semitic comments when the two argued over whether to send their daughters to a private school. According to one document, Picard said, quote, "He said he doesn't like the way they raise their kids to be whiny brats and that he didn't want the girls going to schools with Jews," unquote. Joining us in New York is Richard Cohen, president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So, Richard Cohen, you got the news with everyone else that Steve Bannon would be the chief strategist for Donald Trump. Your thoughts?
Well, it was incredibly disheartening, Amy. You know, the night that Trump was elected, he said that he was going to be the president for all Americans, that he was going to bind the wounds of division, wounds that, of course, that he had caused. And now we see him doing the opposite, you know, appointing someone who was very proud to give a platform to the alt-right. And, you know, the alt-right is, you know, nothing more than the rebranding of white supremacy, white nationalism for the digital age. So Trump says one thing the day he's elected, does something else, at this point. It's really discouraging, really disheartening. And, you know, it doesn't portend well for his administration, I'm afraid.
Richard, describe more fully what is the alt-right? What is the Breitbart News website and the significance of Bannon now being the #2 man for soon-to-be President Trump?
You know, when Breitbart traditionally was a very conservative website, but under Bannon, it's become a cesspool for white supremacy, according to one of his former colleagues. You know, the alt-right is white nationalism. It rejects multiculturalism. It's opposed to immigration. You know, the godfather of the alt-right is a fellow named Richard Spencer. His motto is, "All men are created unequal." He believes that black people are intellectually inferior. He calls for, you know, the peaceful ethnic cleansing of our country. He was ecstatic when Trump was elected, and I'm sure equally ecstatic now that Bannon is in the White House.
Talk about Bannon's background. Talk about his operating of Breitbart News.
Yeah, you know, look, I don't want to talk about Bannon's personal background. I just talk about what he's done at Breitbart News. I mean, anyone can go and look at the archives there and see unbelievable stuff. 2 weeks after the Charleston massacre, for example, you know, they ran an article talking about how people should proudly fly the Confederate flag. They've talked about Islam as a religion of a rape culture. He mocked women who are, the victims of sexual harassment in the workplace. It's obsessed with, the so-called scourge of black on white crime. It's racist, it's misogynist, it's anti-Semitic, it's everything that this country should not be.
Former Breitbart employees have spoken out. This is the site's former editor-in-chief, Ben Shapiro, who wrote, quote, Breitbart has become the alt-right go-to website, with Milo Yiannopoulos pushing white ethno-nationalism as a legitimate response to political correctness, and the comments section turning into a cesspool for white supremacist meme makers. This is Shapiro speaking to CNN earlier this year.
Steve likes to think of himself as the big bear tearing everybody else down because he's a big power player. And look, it's got him where he is now. I think that, again, Steve Bannon, I tweeted this morning, imagine that one of the worst people you know is heading up a presidential campaign, and that's pretty much, where I'm at this morning.
You've been listening to Richard Cohen, your response.
Well, look, Trump knew what he was doing. He ran a racist campaign from the first day that he came down the escalator at Trump Tower. He vilified Mexicans, he vilified Latinos, he vilified, women, black communities, Muslims. And of course, he brought Steve Bannon in because Steve Bannon reflected his views. And unfortunately now he hasn't pivoted despite his words after the election, and he's continuing to embrace Bannon. I wish he would change.
Richard Cohen is president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. I asked you first about Bannon. What about Donald Trump and his election and what this means, and the report that you've put out, Richard, through the Southern Poverty Law Center of the number of attacks this week on vulnerable people? And overall, your response?
Well, look, you mentioned 200 attacks. The number is well over 300 now. And, they're happening everywhere. A lot are happening in schools. We're seeing them in places like Walmart, Starbucks. We're seeing them, just at traffic stops where people are being, people of color are being harassed by people who are passing them and screaming Trump. It's an ugly, incendiary thing. Last night, Donald Trump was on 60 Minutes, and he said, stop it. Of course, he also said it only happened 1 or 2 times. He terribly downplayed it. And, so Trump needs to, say more than stop it. He needs to speak out forcefully against all forms of bigotry. And then he has to follow talk with the walk. He has to stop putting people like Bannon in the administration. He has to, throw him out and assure the American public that no one with hate crime ties, no one with hate in their hearts is going to have any role whatsoever in our democracy.
So these reports around the country of these assaults, of people marching through schools and saying, build that wall or make America white again, the reports we have from Philadelphia to Boston, something unprecedented where the schools are sending counselors into the classrooms because these kids are so frightened after the election of Donald Trump.
Look, they were frightened before the election. They were frightened by the rhetoric that Donald Trump was spewing during the election. We did a big survey during the election asking teachers what was happening in their schools. And we never used Trump's name in the survey, but we didn't have to. 1,000 teachers wrote back and talked about the horrible things that were happening in their school. An incredible increase in bullying, an incredible increase in ugly talk. Heartbreaking stories of young children in elementary schools really being fearful, coming up to a teacher every day and saying, has he built the wall yet? Are my parents going to be deported? This is just a continuation of what we saw in the campaign, but it's really been quite intensified since the day of the election.
Richard Cohen, is there anything you want to add before we go to the voices of the streets of New York? Tens of thousands of people continuing to protest. This was before the appointment of Steve Bannon to be the #2 man for a President Trump.
I would just urge people to stand strong, be careful, don't give up hope. One of the sad things at the election was, 43 million Americans who were eligible to vote did not. That's 100 million people. I don't know how those 100 million people would have voted, but I think our democracy will be healthier when everyone speaks. And so I hope this energy that we're seeing in these demonstrations translates into increased political participation in our country.
And Richard Cohen, finally, how Donald Trump has responded to the attacks on people of color, on immigrants around the country.
He hasn't done enough. He's minimized the number of attacks. He said there's one or two. There have been hundreds. His alter ego at Breitbart has said that they're all just a hoax and a fraud. He needs to do much, much more if America is, going to be a country that embraces all of its citizens.
Well, Richard Cohen, I want to thank you for joining us from New York. Democracy Now! Is in Marrakesh, Morocco for the UN Climate Summit. But I can tell you, every other word out of people's mouths here from around the planet is Donald Trump. Another issue, of course, is his climate denial of deep concern to people here at the UN Climate Summit. Richard Cohen's president of the Southern Poverty Law Center will link to his latest report at democracynow.org. When we come back, though,